It's 2011, Atlantic City, New Jersey. The Tropicana Casino is running numbers they can't make sense of. Over the course of a few months, a single player has walked out of their doors with $6 million. Not $6 million in chips, not $6 million in comps and free rooms and dinners. $6 million in cash, gone from their tables legally. No card counting, no hidden devices, no accomplices, no crime. The pit bosses had watched every hand. The surveillance team had reviewed every hour of footage. The math department had run the numbers 3 times, and every time the answer came back the same. The man had done nothing wrong. He had simply negotiated better rules than the casino realized they were giving him, and then he had played those rules to perfection. His name was Don Johnson, not the actor, not the musician, a 50-year-old horse racing executive from rural Pennsylvania who had never appeared in a gambling headline in his life. And in the span of 6 months in 2011, he beat 3 separate Atlantic City casinos for a combined total of $15 million. He did it in plain sight. He did it with their full cooperation. And when it was over, he gave a series of interviews explaining exactly how he had done it. And the casinos could not dispute a single word he said. This is the story of Don Johnson, the man who looked at a broken industry, read the fine print they had stopped reading themselves, and walked away with $15 million that was always, legally, his to take. And it all began not in a casino, but in a boardroom. Don Johnson was born in 1959 in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. He grew up in a mid-sized house in a working-class neighborhood, the kind of place where nobody had family money and nobody expected any. His father worked, his mother worked. Don worked, starting as a teenager, first in restaurants, then in whatever job paid. He was not a prodigy. He was not a chess champion or a mathematics genius or any of the other archetypes that gambling stories usually reach for. He was something rarer and less cinematic. He was a man who paid attention. He studied business. He worked in the horse racing industry, eventually founding a company called Heritage Development that managed off-track wagering systems in several states. This was not glamorous work. It was regulatory work, contract work, the kind of labor that requires reading dense legal documents and finding the gaps that other people missed because they were skimming. He was good at it. He got very good at it. By his mid-40s, he was running a successful operation that few people outside the horse racing world had heard of. He gambled recreationally for years, blackjack mostly. He was not a degenerate. He was not chasing losses. He played with discipline, studied basic strategy, understood the mathematics of the game. He knew what the house edge was on any given set of rules. He knew that the standard Atlantic City blackjack game, with the rules as casinos typically offered them, gave the house an edge of somewhere between 0.5% and 1%. Small, but enough to grind any player down over time. He had seen it happen to everyone around him. He had felt the edges himself. He understood this was a business, not a game, and the business had been designed very carefully to ensure that the house always, eventually, won. What Don Johnson also understood, and what would matter enormously in what followed, was that the rules were not fixed. The rules of blackjack, the specific conditions under which a casino offered the game, were negotiable, had always been negotiable, at least for players who were willing to bet large amounts. This is called a high roller arrangement, or a table games agreement, and it is a normal part of the casino business. Casinos will adjust rules, reduce the house edge, offer rebates on losses, all in an effort to attract and retain gamblers who are willing to risk enormous sums. The theory from the casino's perspective was always the same. Give a whale slightly better terms. Give them a cushion so they come back. The math still favors the house. The math always favors the house. Or so they had always assumed. The year was 2010. Atlantic City was not doing well. The city that had once been called the East Coast answer to Las Vegas was losing market share to tribal casinos in Connecticut, to newly legalized gambling in neighboring states, and to the internet. Revenues had been falling for years. The casinos needed high rollers badly. They needed them so badly that they had begun competing aggressively for the business of anyone willing to sit down and place large bets. They were offering terms that, in better years, they never would have considered. Don Johnson had been playing at a few of these casinos with moderately large stakes for some time. He was known at several properties. He was the kind of player they wanted to keep. And sometime in late 2010, He began to think seriously about what would happen if he approached the casinos, not as a customer asking for favors, but as a businessman negotiating a contract. He did the math, he ran it carefully. He understood that a standard blackjack game with good rules, say, the dealer standing on soft 17, the player allowed to double down on any two cards, the player allowed to resplit aces, plus a 20% rebate on losses up to $500,000, would not simply reduce the house edge. It would eliminate it, or close enough to eliminate it that the difference became a rounding error. If a player also varied their bet size intelligently, playing larger when the deck was in their favor and smaller when it was not, the edge could actually shift. Not to the player, not quite, but close enough that with sufficient capital and sufficient time, the probability of winning became very real. He approached the casinos with a proposal. It was not presented as anything dramatic. It was presented the way any businessman presents a proposal. These were the conditions under which he was willing to play. These were the bet sizes he was willing to risk. He expected certain rules in return. He walked them through the math, or some version of it. He did not show them all of it. The Borgata said yes first, then the Caesars property in Atlantic City, then the Tropicana. Each of them looked at the deal and saw what they expected to see. A wealthy man willing to put large amounts of money on the table, a player who would generate handle, which is the total amount wagered. A player who would, in the long run, lose. They had run the numbers. Their numbers showed a small but persistent house edge. They signed. What their numbers had failed to account for, or had accounted for incorrectly, was the specific combination of conditions Don Johnson had negotiated. Not one of those conditions alone was enough to flip the odds. Two of them together were not enough. But three of them assembled precisely in the exact configuration he had built, with the specific rules about resplitting and doubling and the specific rebate structure. That combination was something the casino's risk models had not been built to catch. The models were designed for standard deviations. They were not designed for a man who had spent months engineering an exact set of conditions. The first session at the Borgata was in early 2011. Don Johnson sat down at a private table. He was playing at a minimum of $25,000 per hand, sometimes more, sometimes $50,000, sometimes $100,000. The chips moved in blocks that most people never see outside of a movie. The dealers were professional, the pit staff were professional, everyone was calm, and Don Johnson began to win. He walked away from that first session up several $100,000. The Borgata's people made note of it. A good night for the player. It happens. That was what losing sessions were for. Bring him back. He came back. He won again. Not every hand, not every shoe, but across the sessions, the wins came with a consistency that was difficult to attribute to luck alone. By the time the Borgata's accounting department started asking serious questions, Don Johnson had taken them for approximately $4 million over the course of his visits. $4 million, and he had broken no rules. There is a specific feeling that descends on a casino floor when the math stops working. The people who work in surveillance and in the pit have seen the full range of human behavior. They have seen card counters. They have seen cheats. They have seen crossroaders and mechanics and every other species of advantage player. They know what those things look like. And none of what Don Johnson was doing looked like any of them. He was not counting. He was not signaling. He was not doing anything except playing blackjack the way it was supposed to be played, under the rules that the casino had agreed to. $4 million. He moved to Caesars. Same approach, same negotiations, same precision. He ran sessions over several months, spreading them out, managing his playing time, never staying so long that the fatigue worked against him. He walked away from Caesars with approximately $5 million. $5 million, legally, cleanly, from a casino that had reviewed every hand and found nothing wrong. Then he went to the Tropicana. He had refined the process now. He understood the rhythms of these negotiations better. He understood how the risk managers at these properties thought and what blind spots they had. He sat down at the Tropicana's private tables, and over a series of sessions, he took $6 million off their floor. $6 million from the Tropicana, $5 million from Caesars, $4 million from the Borgata, $15 million in total, all from Atlantic City casinos, all in a period of roughly 6 months, all without a single act that any regulatory body could classify as cheating, advantage play, or illegal conduct. He did not hide. He gave interviews. He talked to the press. He explained, in terms that were careful but not evasive, what he had done and how he had done it. He said that the casinos had been so desperate for business that they had offered terms they did not fully understand. He said that he had done the math more carefully than they had. He said that the rules of the game were in negotiation, and that he had simply been better at that negotiation than the people on the other side of the table. The casinos were not amused. The Borgata and the Tropicana and Caesars each conducted internal reviews. Each of them arrived at the same conclusion. They had been outmaneuvered, not cheated, not defrauded, outmaneuvered by a man who had read the fine print more carefully than they had written it. They quietly changed their procedures. They revised their standard table agreements. They stopped offering the specific combination of conditions that Don Johnson had used. But they could not get their money back. There was nothing to get back. The money had been won fairly. There are a few specific elements worth understanding here, because the story is sometimes told as if it were simple, and it was not simple. The 20% rebate on losses was perhaps the most significant piece. Under the terms Johnson negotiated, if he lost during a session and his losses reached a certain threshold, the casino would rebate 20% of those losses back to him. This sounds at first like a minor perk, a cushion. But in practice, a loss rebate of this size, combined with the other rules adjustments, does something subtle and powerful to the mathematics of the game. It asymmetrizes the risk. On his winning sessions, Johnson kept all of his winnings. On his losing sessions, he got 20% back. This meant that his downside was softer than his upside. And a player who can reduce their downside without reducing their upside can, over enough time and with enough capital, overcome what would otherwise be a house advantage. The casinos had offered this kind of rebate to players before. What they had not done, or had not done carefully enough, was model what it meant in combination with the specific rules Johnson had also secured about resplitting aces and doubling down in the dealer's behavior on soft 17. Each rule, by itself, was worth a fraction of a percent. Combined, they added up to something the risk models had not fully captured. Don Johnson was also playing with a very large bankroll. He had the financial resources to sustain variance, to keep playing through losing sessions without panicking and making bad decisions. This is not a trivial advantage. Most players, even disciplined ones, are constrained by the size of their stake. When you are losing badly, the temptation to deviate from optimal strategy, to press when you should pull back or fold when you should push, is enormous. Johnson had enough money behind him that he could play the mathematically correct move on every hand, regardless of his running balance. Discipline is easy to maintain when the money you are risking does not determine whether you eat. And he was disciplined. By all accounts and by his own description, he played correct basic strategy on virtually every hand. No hunches, no feelings, no escalating bets in response to a streak. The mathematics was the only voice he listened to, and he had listened to it for long enough that it had become instinct. The aftermath was not dramatic, as aftermaths go. There were no arrests. There was no confrontation. The casinos absorbed the losses, made their adjustments, and moved on. Don Johnson gave his interviews, collected his money, and returned to his life in Pennsylvania. He talked about the experience with a kind of cheerful directness that casino executives found infuriating. He was not gloating. He was not crowing. He was explaining. This is how I found the edge. This is how I used it. This is what they should have caught and did not. He was correct about the desperation. Atlantic City in 2011 was a city in economic freefall. The financial pressure on these properties was enormous. And when an industry is under pressure, it makes deals it would not otherwise make. It cuts corners in its risk analysis. It signs agreements without reading them as carefully as it should. This is not a phenomenon unique to gambling. It is a phenomenon of any industry under stress. The logic of short-term revenue overwhelms the logic of long-term risk management. The casinos needed the volume. They needed the handle. They needed players willing to put $100,000 on a single hand of blackjack, because that is the kind of action that keeps the lights on and the shareholders appeased. Don Johnson offered them that action. He offered them exactly what they needed. And he was very careful, very deliberate in the price he charged them for it. There is a version of this story that gets told as a miracle. as if some divine alignment of luck fell on a man one winter and carried him to $15 million. That version is comfortable. It fits inside the familiar shape of a gambling narrative, the lucky streak, the man touched by fate. But it is not what happened. What happened was calculation. What happened was a man who understood the product he was consuming better than the people selling it did. What happened was the oldest arbitrage in commerce. Find a mispriced asset, buy it, profit. The asset, in this case, was a set of blackjack rules that the casinos had priced incorrectly. Don Johnson found the price discrepancy, quantified it, negotiated access to it, and collected the difference. 15 million times. He has spoken about it in the years since with a kind of philosophical even-handedness that is either admirable or unsettling, depending on where you sit. He does not describe himself as having beaten the casinos. He describes himself as having found conditions under which the game was fair, or close to fair, and then having played it correctly. He points out that the casinos were not victims. They were sophisticated institutions with entire departments devoted to risk analysis, and those departments made errors, expensive errors. He simply found the errors before they did. There is something worth sitting with in that framing, because the casinos are not, by design, institutions that offer fair games. They're institutions that offer games that look fair from a distance, but are not. The house edge is the product. The experience, the lights, the drinks, the atmosphere, the thrill. That is the packaging. The product itself is a mathematical guarantee that, over time, the casino keeps a percentage of everything wagered. And that product is sold to millions of people who do not fully understand what they are buying. Don Johnson understood what he was buying, and for 6 months in 2011, he bought something different. Something that, for a brief window, the sellers had miscalculated. As of the most recent reporting on him, Don Johnson returned to his life in the horse racing business after the Atlantic City episode. He gave a notable interview to The Atlantic magazine in which he laid out his approach in considerable detail. He did not claim to have revolutionized gambling. He claimed to have done something specific and precise on a specific set of occasions and then walked away when the conditions changed. He seemed neither particularly proud nor particularly reflective about it. It was a deal. He had gotten good terms, that was it. The casinos have not offered those terms again. The regulatory changes that followed were quiet and institutional. No legislation, no public inquiry, just a memo here and an adjusted agreement template there. The kind of change that happens when a large corporation realizes it has been making a costly mistake and moves to correct it without drawing attention to how long the mistake had been running. In the years that followed, Atlantic City's decline continued. Several of the properties where Don Johnson had played closed entirely. The Revel, which opened in 2012 with over $2 billion invested and closed 2 years later, became the most spectacular example of what was happening to the market. The city's casino revenues kept falling. The industry restructured. The desperate competition for high rollers that had made Johnson's negotiations possible became, ironically, less possible, as the casinos that survived became more conservative and more careful. Some ironies write themselves. Don Johnson took $15 million from an industry that was already struggling, using tools the industry had handed him. He did it legally. He did it openly. He then went home and explained, in patient detail, exactly how he had done it. And the casinos, having listened, quietly changed their rules so that no one else could do the same thing. Whether that is a story about genius or about opportunity or about the specific blindness of institutions that believe they are too sophisticated to be outmaneuvered, depends on who you ask. Don Johnson would probably say it is simply a story about reading the contract. He is right, and that somehow makes it stranger. Not less impressive, just stranger. Because the $15 million were always there, sitting in the fine print, waiting for someone patient enough and careful enough and capitalized enough to go and get them. Don Johnson was that someone, and when it was done, he drove home to Pennsylvania, and the casinos went back to work, and the chips kept moving, and the lights kept burning, and the whole enormous machine kept grinding forward, as it always had, and always would. Only now, they had read the fine print.